Sometimes life sends signals that are too precise to ignore. Small moments unfold like coincidences that feel almost intentional, even when you are not looking for meaning. You may notice a strange kind of stillness around you, or a message that feels like it was meant for you but never fully arrived. A presence seems to show up exactly when you decide to let go and move forward. There is always a turning point in deep emotional connections where, on the surface, nothing appears different, yet internally everything has already changed. You might have been carrying a subtle unease for days or even weeks. Not fear exactly, but a quiet certainty you cannot easily explain. It feels as if the atmosphere itself has become heavier, more charged. Memories surface without warning. Emotions rise unexpectedly. Thoughts of someone who is not physically present begin appearing in moments you did not invite. And in those moments, something inside you already knows. Pause for a moment. Breathe. Notice what your inner world has been trying to communicate for much longer than your thoughts have allowed. Even if your mind tries to dismiss it, what you are sensing is not random. It is not imagination filling gaps. That pressure in your chest, that emotional intensity you cannot fully name, is not simply longing or wishful thinking. It is the way your system registers change in a bond that once felt stable. What is unfolding is a shift in connection, a tightening, a deepening, and at the same time, a disruption. Today, we are looking at the person who once held back emotionally, but is now experiencing something they can no longer fully suppress. A fear is rising in them, the fear of losing you. Not the surface-level fear of possession or control, but something deeper, more instinctive, almost existential. At some point, they may have assumed you would always remain available, that you would wait, that you would stay in the same emotional position while they figured themselves out. But emotional dynamics do not stay frozen. When your energy changes, the entire structure of the connection responds. And you did change. The moment you stopped waiting in the same way, something shifted between you. It may not have been dramatic or obvious, but it was enough to disturb the emotional equilibrium. Something inside them registered that shift, even if their conscious mind tried to ignore it. No matter how much pride they hold, no matter how many logical explanations they create for distance or silence, there comes a point where mental control weakens and something deeper takes over. The emotional truth begins to surface. In that space, they are forced to confront a possibility they avoided for a long time, that you may not remain part of their future. And that realization does not arrive quietly. You do not need confirmation through messages or calls to sense it. Deep connections do not operate through logic or schedules. They operate through emotional resonance, through vibration, and when that resonance changes, it is felt on both sides. What is happening now is a kind of inner awakening in them, something uncomfortable, something they did not plan for. Many people will never fully engage with insights like this, not because they do not feel them, but because they feel them too strongly. If you are still here, still reflecting on this, it means something in you is already awake to the shift. And what follows is an understanding that goes beyond simple attraction or separation. It becomes about emotional truth. We often believe silence means disconnection. We assume distance means indifference. But in lived emotional reality, silence is often where the deepest internal changes begin to form. The person who once seemed distant, unclear, or emotionally inconsistent is now entering a phase where avoidance no longer works the same way. Their usual distractions lose effectiveness. Emotional suppression becomes harder to maintain. Something within them starts pushing toward resolution, not because they consciously choose it, but because the internal imbalance created by your emotional withdrawal demands attention. And to understand why this is happening, you have to recognize what actually changed in you. Without fully realizing it, you altered the emotional structure of the relationship. There was a time when your energy flowed outward continuously, toward them, toward understanding them, toward holding the connection together. It carried uncertainty, waiting, and emotional dependence. Not because you lacked strength, but because you cared and remained invested. From their perspective, that consistent emotional availability may have created a sense of stability without effort. They did not have to reach for you in the same way because you were already extending yourself. But that pattern did not remain the same. Something inside you began to shift. You started returning to yourself, not as a strategy, not as punishment, but as a form of inner correction. Self-prioritization replaced emotional overextension, and that is where everything changed. When attention is withdrawn, the emotional field reorganizes itself. What was once filled by pursuit and anticipation becomes empty space. And that space is not neutral, it is active. This is sometimes described as the physics of emotional absence. Not physical distance, but the absence of emotional access and availability. To be physically absent means not being present in someone's daily life. But emotional absence means no longer being internally centered around them, no longer seeking validation, no longer holding them as the emotional reference point. That difference is profound. Imagine a rope held tightly between two people. If one person is constantly pulling, the other only has to resist. They can remain passive. But when that tension is suddenly released, balance is disrupted. The dynamic cannot continue in the same form. Now the other person is left adjusting to something unfamiliar, the loss of constant emotional anchoring. This is what creates inner disturbance. Not noise, not conflict, but silence, where emotional certainty used to be. And in that silence, reflection begins. They start noticing things they ignored before. They begin re-evaluating what they took for granted. The absence does not simply remove connection, it exposes truth. From a psychological perspective, this is where projection begins to break down. When you were fully engaged, you often became the place where they could unconsciously place their own unresolved fears. If closeness felt overwhelming, it could be labeled as pressure from you. If vulnerability felt unsafe, it could be projected onto your emotional expression. But once you step back, that projection screen disappears. Now they are left alone with their own emotional landscape, without anything external to deflect it onto, and that can be deeply unsettling. What emerges is not just missing you as a person, but confronting what you represented emotionally within their inner world. In many cases, the person you connect with becomes tied to an internal image they carry of themselves, so losing access to you can feel like losing access to a part of their own emotional identity. This is why the fear intensifies. Not because of dependency alone, but because something within them recognizes significance that was previously denied or minimized. And now, that recognition cannot be easily reversed. What is being activated in them is not just attachment, it is awareness. A realization that what was present in this connection may not be easily replaced or recreated elsewhere, and whether they act on it or resist it, something has already shifted. This realization carries immense emotional weight because it forces them to see what truly matters in their life with far greater clarity than before. The very inner shadow that once pushed them toward distance and avoidance now begins to reveal a different truth. That real safety was never outside the connection they stepped away from, but inside the bond they struggled to stay present in. What they are coming to understand is not the absence of love, but their inability to hold the depth of what they actually felt, and that creates an internal conflict that is no longer easy to ignore. It becomes a quiet but intense struggle between two parts of themselves. On one side, the ego demands control, certainty, and emotional distance as a form of protection. On the other side, something deeper and more honest recognizes that what they experienced with you felt like home in a way they did not fully acknowledge at the time. When someone is led primarily by fear, they can appear detached, even indifferent. But the moment their deeper emotional self begins to register the real possibility of permanent loss, that emotional defense starts to weaken. From there, their mind begins to revisit everything. Old conversations resurface. Small moments that once felt insignificant now carry meaning. They start reinterpreting the past, assembling fragments of memory into a clearer emotional picture they could not see before. It begins to feel as though life itself is showing them what they failed to value when it was still within reach. But this awareness does not bring peace. Instead, it creates tension. a growing inner pressure, a sense of urgency they cannot easily explain. They are no longer emotionally aligned within themselves. One part of them wants to maintain distance, to stay protected and unchanged. Yet another, deeper force keeps pulling them back toward you, toward what was felt but never fully expressed. This internal split does not stay quiet. It begins to influence their behavior in ways that go beyond ordinary sadness or reflection. What is unfolding is not a temporary emotional reaction. It is a deeper transformation that feels irreversible. Even if they appear composed on the outside, that outer stability becomes increasingly deceptive. Life continues as normal in appearance. Work, social interactions, daily routines, they all continue. But internally, something far less stable is unfolding beneath the surface. There is a growing sense of restlessness within them, a pressure that follows them even in silence. It becomes harder for them to maintain emotional distance from what they are feeling, even if they try to present control outwardly. At a deeper level, they are beginning to understand something essential. You cannot escape what you carry within yourself, and what they carried with you was never fully resolved. This restlessness becomes persistent. It disrupts their peace in subtle but constant ways. And one of the first places it shows is in their sleep. There is often a noticeable shift, difficulty falling asleep or waking in the early hours of the morning, around that quiet 3 to 4 a.m. window when external distractions disappear and only internal thoughts remain. In those moments, the mind loses its usual defenses. What was suppressed during the day begins to surface without resistance. And in that silence, thoughts of you return, not as chosen memories, but as emotional impressions that arrive on their own. During the day, it becomes no easier. Concentration slips. Thoughts interrupt without warning. Even in ordinary moments while working, talking, or driving, something can suddenly trigger a memory of you. Not the conflicts, not the difficult parts, but the emotional warmth, the sense of closeness, the feeling of being understood. The mind begins to reshape the narrative. It naturally gravitates toward what felt meaningful while softening everything else. And this contrast between memory and current reality becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. In today's world, this internal conflict often expresses itself through behavior that remains hidden. Pride prevents direct communication, so instead there is silent observation. They may not reach out, they may not engage openly, but they observe, quietly, consistently, checking updates, watching from a distance, revisiting traces of past connection in ways that allow them to feel close without exposing vulnerability. This is not simple curiosity. It is a form of emotional monitoring, a way of confirming that the connection still exists in some form, even if it cannot be acted upon directly. And yet, this only deepens the emotional tension. Because seeing you move forward, seeing signs of peace or independence, creates a complex emotional response within them. Relief that you are okay, but also fear that you may no longer be emotionally available to them in the same way. What they are truly reacting to is not just your presence in the world, but the possibility that your emotional world no longer revolves around them. And that realization intensifies everything. The distance no longer feels neutral. It becomes active, meaningful, heavy. Over time, this unspoken emotional pressure does not stay contained. It begins to influence the inner space between you in ways that are difficult to articulate. Not as something mystical, but as emotional resonance, two systems still responding to one another, even in separation. You may begin to notice shifts within yourself that do not have an obvious source, sudden waves of emotion, moments of heaviness or longing that appear without context, a sense that something is unfolding beyond what you can directly see. Whether or not you interpret this symbolically, what is undeniable is that deep emotional bonds often leave lasting impressions on both people involved. The mind and body continue to process what has not been fully resolved. This is why even silence can feel active, even absence can feel present. And as time continues, the emotional field between two people does not simply disappear. It reorganizes, it adapts. It continues to express what was never fully brought into clarity. What follows is often a period of intensified internal struggle for the other person, because as much as they try to maintain distance, something within them keeps moving toward recognition of what was lost, what was felt, and what was never fully expressed. And that tension builds until it reaches a point where emotional resistance begins to weaken, not suddenly, but gradually, under the weight of everything they can no longer ignore. This is your test. Do you trust what is visible on the surface, or do you trust what you feel at a deeper level that words can't fully explain? Because the moment you move toward them too quickly, you return the dynamic to its old pattern, the place where resistance felt safe for them. But when you stay centered in your own truth, something very different begins to happen. The pressure that has been building in silence is allowed to complete its course without interruption. What looks like stillness on the outside is often intensity on the inside. And in this case, the silence they maintain is not peace, it is internal conflict. This person is living inside a contradiction they can no longer easily escape. One part of them feels drawn toward you with increasing clarity, while another part insists on emotional distance as a form of control. Holding both states at once becomes exhausting over time. No one can indefinitely maintain the performance of indifference without it beginning to crack. It is like water building behind a barrier. At first, the structure holds. Pride, logic, and carefully constructed explanations keep everything contained, but when emotional pressure increases, especially when it is tied to genuine attachment, that structure is not designed to hold forever. Eventually, something gives, and when it does, it is not subtle. It is an internal collapse of the emotional defenses that were used to avoid truth. The person who once relied on distance to protect themselves suddenly finds themselves overwhelmed by everything they tried not to feel. At that point, control stops feeling like strength and starts feeling like confinement. What follows is not confusion, but recognition. A shift where they can no longer deny what the connection actually meant. And that recognition begins to pull them back toward you, not out of fantasy, but out of emotional clarity they can no longer suppress. If this message resonates with what you've been experiencing, it is a moment to stay grounded in your own awareness and not lose yourself in anticipation of what comes next. Because once this internal resistance breaks, the nature of their behavior begins to change. What used to be avoidance turns into reflection. They begin to look back not with distance but with clarity. Memories that were once dismissed start returning with emotional weight. Conversations, moments, and subtle exchanges take on new meaning in hindsight. It feels to them like finally understanding something they were not ready to understand before. This stage is not comfortable. It brings emotional instability rather than peace. They are caught between the version of themselves that resisted connection and the version that now recognizes its importance. That inner division creates pressure that cannot remain hidden for long. Externally, nothing may look different at first. Life continues, routines remain intact, they still appear composed, functional, and in control, but internally, the structure is shifting. There is a growing inability to maintain emotional distance without consequence. The effort to suppress what they feel becomes more draining than the feeling itself. And gradually, the mind begins to return to you, not as an idea, but as an emotional reality that keeps resurfacing. This often shows up most strongly in quiet moments, at night, early morning, or during pauses in daily life when distractions fade. In those spaces, thoughts become less filtered. Emotional truths rise without permission. You re-enter their awareness not because they are choosing it, but because it is unresolved. During the day, it can appear differently. Focus slips, attention breaks, ordinary situations suddenly trigger memory, something said, something seen, something that reminds them of what existed between you. And what returns is rarely conflict. It is connection, the emotional tone of what was shared, not just what was said. Over time, this creates a shift in perception. The mind naturally begins to emphasize what felt meaningful and soften what created discomfort, not as denial, but as emotional prioritization. In modern life, this internal process often expresses itself quietly, not through direct contact, but through observation from a distance. A hesitation to engage openly, replaced by subtle awareness of your presence in their world. Not interaction, but attention. This creates a complicated emotional state within them. Seeing you continue forward brings both relief and uncertainty. Relief that you are okay, and uncertainty about whether your emotional place in their life remains the same. Because what unsettles them most is not distance itself, but the possibility that you are no longer emotionally oriented toward them. That realization changes the emotional landscape entirely. As this continues, the internal pressure does not stay contained. It begins to move through them in waves of reflection, regret, and recognition. The resistance weakens not through force, but through exhaustion. Eventually, something shifts from within. The emotional denial becomes harder to maintain than emotional honesty. And that is where movement begins. Not sudden, but inevitable in direction. They begin to approach life differently in relation to you, not necessarily with action immediately, but with awareness. The idea of reconnecting becomes less avoidable, more present, more real. What once felt optional starts to feel necessary. At the same time, your own emotional state begins to change. The searching, the questioning, the internal scanning for signs, it starts to reduce. Not because you force it to stop, but because something in you recognizes that the imbalance is shifting. There is a quiet settling that replaces uncertainty. This is often what happens when emotional pursuit on one side ends and internal recognition begins on the other. The system recalibrates. You may notice more stillness within yourself, less urgency, less emotional reaching, a natural withdrawal from the need to interpret every sign or signal. That state is not detachment in the absence of care. It is detachment from emotional dependency, and from that space everything becomes clearer. Because when need dissolves, perception sharpens. The connection is no longer experienced as confusion, it becomes something you observe rather than chase. And in that shift, the dynamic begins to reorganize itself toward balance. What follows is not fantasy or collapse, it is transition, a movement from emotional resistance toward emotional acknowledgement. And whether or not it manifests in direct communication immediately, the internal process has already changed direction. At this stage, the most important thing is not to reverse your position by returning to old patterns of chasing or overextending. The transformation only stabilizes when your internal stance remains consistent. Because what is ultimately changing here is not just their awareness of you, but your relationship to yourself within the connection. And that is what determines everything that comes next.